Okay, let's go ahead and get going, shall we? So, we're up to chapter 8, I believe. No, 9. Chapter 9 of the Hiram Key. This is a shorter chapter tonight, but I'm only going to do one chapter. Um, so, let's see. Chapter 9 is the birth of Judaism. That should be interesting. I've read several different things that are kind of out there about the origins of Judaism. Okay, the birth of Judaism. Moses the lawgiver. Our task was to work forward in time, step by step, to see if we could establish a continuous Masonic style ceremony linking the Egyptian New Kingdom to the time of Jesus. This was going to be difficult because our only source of information was going to be the Old Testament, but at least we had our Masonic ritual to aid interpretation. Fortunately, the Bible is unequivocal that the Jewish nation started with one man, and there is little doubt that an individual by the name of Moses did exist, and that he was connected with some type of exodus of enslaved Asiatics from Egypt. After the expulsion of the Hyksos Semites of all kinds, including the Hebrew, must have been more than a little unpopular, and it would explain why the otherwise friendly Egyptians suddenly enslaved many or even all of those who remained in the country during the decade 1560 to 1550 BC. Inscriptions from the 16th and 15th centuries BC have been found giving details of these Hebrew slaves and their forced labor. One tells of how large numbers of these people were forced to work in turquoise mines, which must have been extremely dangerous and unpleasant without ventilation and with naked flames burning up the oxygen. We were interested to find that these mines were just a short distance from the mountain of Yahweh, Mount Sinai, in the southern mountains of the Sinai Peninsula. Was this coincidence? We wondered, or could the breakout of the Hebrew slaves have occurred here rather than in Egypt proper? We found that records show that although these proto-Jews spoke in the Canaanite language, they worshipped Egyptian deities and set up monuments to the gods Osiris, Ptah, and Hathor, which does not tie in with the popular image of the noble enslaved followers of Yahweh yearning to be led to Jerusalem by the God of their fathers. The story of Moses is retold to every Jewish and Christian child, and therefore tends to stay with the adult as a matter of historical fact, even if most people discount the exotic elements, such as the parting of the Red Sea. Exactly when this event happened is hard to pinpoint, but formerly the most commonly held opinion was that Moses led his people out of Egypt during the reign of Ramses II, which would place the event between 1290 and 1224 BC. There is, however, very good evidence recently put together to support a much earlier date, very close to the time of the expulsion of the Hyksos. But before we delve into the issue of dating, it is important to consider what we know of the man called Moses and what the Bible tells us about the Israelites and their new God. We found that the name Moses itself is very revealing. Strangely, the Roman Catholic Douai Bible informs its readers that it is Egyptian for saved out of water, whereas it actually means simply born of. The name normally required another name prefixed to it, such as Thothmoses, born of Thoth, Ramses, born of Ra, or Amen-Moses, born of Amen. Whilst the Moses element is spelled slightly differently when rendered in English, they all mean the same thing, and it seems very likely to us that either Moses himself or some later scribe dropped the name of an Egyptian god from the front of his name. It is rather like taking the Donald part out of a Scotsman's name, leaving him with Mac instead of MacDonald. The Roman Catholic definition is probably wrong, but if there is some historical truth in the idea, it could be that Moses' full name was Born of the Nile, in which case he would have been called Hapimosis, which would have been written down as these symbols. Okay, then those hieroglyphs, I should say. I said symbols, hieroglyphs. Um, the name Moses is unusual as it is one of very few ancient Egyptian words still popular today. In its Hebrew form, Moshe, or Moshe, Moshe, I'm sure I'm mispronouncing it, and its Arabic form, Musa, M-U-S-A, the Egyptians still call Mount Sinai Jubal Musa, the mountain of Moses. It is impossible today to know just how much of the story of Moses given in the Old Testament is historical and how much is romantic invention. According to the book of Exodus, the Pharaoh instructed that all Israelite male children were to be thrown into the Nile. This is almost impossible to believe as an historical event, as such a barbaric decree would have been totally at odds with the concept of Ma'at held so dear by the Egyptians. Any pharaoh giving this command would be giving up his right to an afterlife when his heart was weighed. Furthermore, on a practical level, it would have been very unpleasant and unhealthy to have thousands of rotting corpses floating about in the population's only source of water. According to the Old Testament, Moses' mother was determined not to let her infant son die, so she placed him in the bulrushes at the edge of the Nile in a basket daubed with pitch where he was found by the Pharaoh's daughter. It has long been noticed that this birth episode is almost identical to that of Sargon I, the king who reigned over Babylon and Sumer many hundreds of years before Moses. What's going on here? I don't know. Yeah, okay. Um, Sorry about that. Many hundreds of years before Moses. A quick comparison demonstrates the obvious similarities. So he's got two side by side lists, Sargon on the left, then Moses. So I'll read each entry in Sargon, then Moses. So Sargon, my changeling mother conceived me, in secret she bore me. Moses, a Levite woman, conceived me and bore a son. Conceived and bore a son. She hid him for 3 months, but she could not conceal him any longer. Sargon's side version. She set me in a basket of rushes with bitumen. She sealed my lid. She cast me into the river, which rose not over me. So on the Moses side, it says So she got a rush basket for me, made it watertight with clay and tar, laid him in it. Oh, I said me earlier. It was him, sorry. Laid him in it and put it among the reeds by the bank of the Nile. Okay, that's the end of those two lists. We concluded that the birth story is almost certainly a fiction created in the 6th century BC, echoing for the birth of the Jewish nation the ancient theme of creation emerging from the waters. It was also an excellent way of rationalizing how a general in the Egyptian army and member of the Egyptian royal family came to be founding father of the Jewish people. This is something we will come to shortly. We had no doubt that some aspects of the story were later inventions. One such was the description of Moses' mother as a Levite woman. That was an attempt to put history into an order that suited the story's later authors. Levites became the priestly tribe, and so the scribes, using the logic of their own time, reasoned that Moses must have been a priest and therefore a Levite. The book of Exodus has clear indications of being a patchwork of 3 oral versions of the traditional history of the coming out of Egypt, with confusion as to whether Moses or Aaron was the main player. Even the name of the mountain where Moses met with Yahweh varies between Mount Sinai and Mount Horeb. We had to keep reminding ourselves that the authors of the early books of the Old Testament were writing down tribal legends from their distant past, the most ancient stories being literally thousands of years old, and even the recent ones, such as those of David and Solomon, were hundreds of years before their time. The general shape of the supposed events were clear, but historical details were completely missing. Excuse me. Different authors filled the gaps in different ways, depending on their political view of the world and their opinion as to how things should have been. Experts have been able to disentangle these layers of authorship, and they have been given such unexciting designations as J, E, D, and P. The modern day access to far greater historical information than these groups had. With modern day access to far greater historical information than these groups had, we can quickly spot high levels of invention. For example, these authors describe camels as beasts of burden and the use of coins at the time of Isaac and Joseph, when in fact neither occurred until much later. Another significant mistake is the description of Abraham avoiding southern Israel as the land of the Philistines, when we now know that they did not arrive until well after the Israelites had come out of Egypt. If the book of Exodus had told us which Pharaoh's daughter had found the baby Moses, things would be a lot easier, but clearly the authors had no idea themselves. We reasoned that there could only be three basic explanations for Moses being at the center of the Egyptian royal family. One, actually, let me take a sip here first. One, he was an Asiatic or Habiru by birth and was taken into the family as a baby or small child, as the Old Testament suggests. It is known that the Egyptians did take in the children of neighboring countries, so that as adults they could influence their people favorably towards the Egyptians. At first this seems unlikely at a time so close to the Hyksos period when the Habiru were enslaved. Two, he was a high-born Egyptian who, as a man, found himself on the run for murder and who adopted the Habiru as his outlaw followers. Or three, he was a young Semite general in the army of the last Hyksos king and was driven out of Egypt into the wilderness with the rest of the Asiatic hordes when the Theban monarchy regained control. He later returned to lead the Habiru slaves to freedom. This would put the Moses story much earlier than has ever been considered before, but there is no reason why it could not be so. Moses is known to have been a general in the army of an unidentified pharaoh. This third option has attractions, but we could not at first find sufficient evidence for such an early timing. Moreover, to learn the secrets of the Egyptians, Moses must have been involved with a true pharaoh, not a Hyksos impostor. We therefore accepted that the truth lay with either the first or the second of these options. In both cases, the biblical version of events is accepted as broadly correct. For our purposes, we decided not to dwell on the circumstances of exactly how Moses came to lead these proto-Israelites. It is sufficient to accept that an extremely high-ranking member of the Egyptian court became the leader of some of the tribes that would become the nations of the Jews. Acts chapter 7, verse 22 tells us that, quote, Moses was learned in all the wisdom of the Egyptians, end quote. The Israelites who wrote of Moses all these years later had no reason to invent his closeness with the opponents of their forefathers, and they clearly believed that he had been invested with great secrets, indeed all of the secrets. By the time that Moses was involved with the Egyptian royal family, the new kingdom would have been established, and the substituted secrets would have replaced the original secrets of Osiris. As a senior member of the Pharaoh's court, Moses must have been instructed in the principles of resurrection described around the legend of Sekenenretau and his fearless sacrifice, which replaced the lost genuine secrets. For the young Moses, this ritual was to acquaint him with the secrets of king-making. the highest expression of power, the mere possession of which was a mark of royalty. This must have been a deep impression upon him. This must have made a deep impression upon him, because he surely carried the story with him, so that it eventually became the new secret rite of passage for king-making in the new land of Israel. Because it was secret and only passed to the smallest possible group of principal Jews, the story of the king that was lost, quote unquote, passed on into the royal line of David, which without much change. The details of the Exodus were a lower level story available to everyone, and truth and fiction merged until little reality remained. Whatever the route taken, the biblical story of the Exodus clearly demonstrates that the group led by Moses was highly Egyptianized, and the worship of Egyptian deities was normal practice. Moses receiving the Ten Commandments on tablets of stone was absolutely necessary to mark the establishment of a new state. Every king had to be given his royal charter from the gods as proof that he was fit to lead and that there was a basis for law and order in the new society. These tablets could only have been written in Egyptian hieroglyphics, as Moses would not have understood any other script. Because today we rely on the written word on a daily basis, it is difficult for us to understand how special writing was considered to be in the second millennium BC. The idea of messages materializing out of marks on stone amazed ordinary people, and the scribes who could make stone talk, quote unquote, were considered to be holders of great magic. This is easily appreciated when one realizes that the Egyptians called hieroglyphics the words of the god, a term that would often be repeated throughout the Bible. The war god of the mountains of Sinai. Reading the story of the Exodus carefully and objectively left us horrified. The view that had been formed in our minds during our Christian-focused upbringing was quickly turned on its head. Instead of a noble and great people winning their freedom and finding their promised land, we read a disturbing catalog of primitive demonology, betrayal, mass murder, rape, vandalism, and grand theft. It was the most disgraceful statement of origin for a new nation imaginable. The story of Moses starts with a murder. He sees an Egyptian hitting a Hebrew, and after looking around to be sure no one is looking, he kills the Egyptian. The first of tens of thousands of murders this ex-soldier will commit. Unfortunately, the crime was witnessed by other Hebrew who reported the incident to the Egyptians, so Moses became a wanted man. He went on the run, heading east into the Sinai, where he was taken in by the Midianites, also called Kenites, and where he married the king's daughter, Zipporah. It was here that Moses was introduced to the god of the Midianite tribes, a god of storms and of war whose symbol was a crucifix-like motif worn on their foreheads. It later became known as the Yahweh mark. This god who lived in the mountains provided the inspiration and central theme for the God of the Jews following Moses' conversations with him on Mount Horeb. Gods rarely, if ever, spontaneously pop into existence. They develop naturally and undergo metamorphosis as they absorb qualities transposed from other deities. The first recorded meeting with the God of the Jews and Christians seemed strangely cold and threatening. When Moses inquired about his credentials and asked for his name, he was being very smart, but it did not work. Moses knew from his Egyptian upbringing that gods were not always superior to humans, and if a man could extract the name of the god, he would have power over him. In Egypt, gods usually had many names ranging from a common, widely known one to increasingly restricted names, but their fundamental designation was given to no man or other god. If Moses had received the answer to his question regarding the god's principal name, he would have effectively enslaved the god. Theology and magic have always been totally synonymous concepts until relatively recent times, when we have managed to draw an imaginary line between the two halves of primitive human mysticism. The concept of the God of the Israelites living in his ark is no different to a genie living in his bottle granting wishes to his friends. Both indulge in such activities as flying through the air, dividing whole seas, sending out fireballs, and generally ignoring the laws of nature. Today we maintain a frail mental separation between the stories of the Arabian Nights and those of the Bible, but there is no doubt they share a common origin. It will be hard for many people to accept, but if we take what the Bible says at face value, then the creator figure, whom the Western world calls simply God, started out as a humble genie living on his wits in the mountains of Northeast Africa and Southeast Asia. Fearful for his independence, the Midianite God refused Moses' question as to his name and tried to establish his own importance by telling Moses to take off his shoes and keep back because he is on holy ground. The book of Exodus tells us that God's reply to the question of his name was Ehyeh Asher Ehyeh. I know I didn't pronounce that right. This is usually translated as I am who I am, but in the parlance of the authors of the work, this carried a stronger import and would be better rendered as mind your own damn business. The names Yahweh or Jehovah are both modern pronunciations from the Hebrew description God as Yod-Heh-Vah-Heh. I actually do know that one when they spell it YHWH. The Hebrew language has no vowels, which is why it's Yod-Heh-Vah-Heh if you say the letters. This was not the god's name. More likely it was a title taken from the given answer, meaning I am. According to the Bible story, Moses eventually returned to Egypt to release the bands of assorted Asiatics, whom the Egyptians called Habiru, from slavery, supposedly using the powers of his new storm genie God, jinn/genie/god, to bring misery and death to the unfortunate Egyptians. We are told that 600,000 Israelites left for a 40-year journey through the desert, but it is clear to every intelligent observer that any such exodus could have only involved a fraction of this number. There is no trace of such an event in Egyptian history, and had it been an event on the scale claimed in the Bible, there would have been. Had the group been this size, they would have represented a quarter of the entire population of Egypt, and given the effect that such a migration would have had on food requirements and labor supply, the Egyptians would certainly have recorded its social impact. Nevertheless, whatever the number, Moses then took his people into the Sinai, back to the Midianite encampment, and greeted his father-in-law Jethro, who congratulated the Israelites and gave wise advice to Moses. The prophet then went back up the sacred mountain for a meeting with the God who still lived there. The storm god who lived in a black cloud told Moses that if any of the Israelites or their animals set foot upon the mountain, or even touched it, he would kill them by shooting them through or stoning them. The new God then informed his new followers that they were required to worship him, or he would take vengeance not only on the individuals concerned, but their children, grandchildren, and beyond. He went on to demand that the Israelites give him gifts of gold, silver, brass, fine linen, badgers' skins, and shittim wood, acacia, and build an ark completely covered in gold for him to live in. This ark was of classical Egyptian design with two so-called cherubim on top, which are now universally accepted as being a pair of winged phoenixes. That is, winged lions with human heads. See figure 6. I think maybe that's in the picture pages, maybe. I don't know, because I don't see a figure 6 here anywhere. There are no figures. Yeah, so I don't know. This new god cannot have made too much of an impression upon the majority of the Israelites, as they made a golden calf as soon as Moses had climbed up his mountain to talk to Yahweh. This effigy was most likely a representation of the Egyptian god Apis, which greatly upset the new god. He instructed Moses to command his priests to kill as many of these sinners as possible, and we are told 3,000 Israelites were slain. And the walls came tumbling down. As the Israelites moved towards their promised land, there was only one obstacle between them and the achievement of their goal, the indigenous population. But Yahweh had led them to victory over the farmers of Canaan. The book of Deuteronomy, Douai version, explains events as God's chosen people started to threaten the city-states of Canaan in parts of chapters 2 and 3. So we have a very long quote here. Quote, and I know I'm mispronounce these words, so here's quote, and Sihon came out to meet us with all his people to fight at Jassa. And the Lord our God delivered him to us, and we slew him with his sons and all his people. And we took all his cities at that time, killing the inhabitants of them, men, women, and children. We left nothing of them, except the cattle which came to the share of them that took them, and the spoils of the cities which we took. From Aroer, which is upon the bank of the torrent Arnon, a town that is situate in a valley as far as Galaad, there was not a village or city that escaped our hands. The Lord our God delivered all unto us. Then we turned and went by way of Basan, and Og the king of Basan came out to meet us with his people to fight Edrei. And the Lord said to me, fear him not, because he is delivered into thy hand, with all his people and his land, and thou shalt do to him as thou hast done to Sihon king of the Amorites, that dwelt in Heshbon. So the Lord our God delivered into our hands Og also the king of Basan and all his people, and we utterly destroyed them, wasting all his cities at one time. There was not a town that escaped us. 60 cities, all the country of Argob, the kingdom of Og in Basan. All the cities were fenced with very high walls and with gates and bars, besides innumerable towns that had no walls. And we utterly destroyed them, as we had done to Sihon the king of Heshbon, destroying every city, men and women and children, but the cattle and the spoils of the cities we took for our prey. End quote. These passages do not describe battles so much as massacres, where every man, woman, and child, as well as sheep, ox, and ass, were put to death by sword. The Old Testament contains many more passages of this violent type. In addition, Yahweh reminds his people that he is ever powerful and ready to fiercely punish those that fail to worship him and live by his word. Deuteronomy chapter 8, verses 19 and 20 give the following warning, quote, but if you forget the Lord thy God, and follow strange gods, and serve and adore them, behold, now I foretell thee that thou shalt utterly perish. As the nations which the Lord destroyed at thy entrance, so shall you also perish, if you be disobedient to the voice of the Lord your God. End quote. Moreover, Moses actually was, I don't know where I got moreover. Whoever Moses actually was, he became a murderer in Egypt and spent the rest of his life killing huge numbers of people, both strangers and those who had placed their trust in him. We found it difficult to reconcile both this man and his view of God with the God of modern Jews and Christians. To us, this disparity proves the idea of God is not a static entity, but a social focus that grows and evolves as he intertwines with other gods, slowly evolving into an idealized figurehead who reflects the morality and needs of the time. It is not so much that God made him in his image, it is more that man continually recrafts God in his image. I think that's also maybe the source of the current theories that are floating around that the God of the Old Testament is actually the demiurge, and that then there's the different God that is the God of the New Testament. I didn't make it up. I'm just letting you know it's out there if you didn't already know. The timing of the Exodus. Some scholars now believe that the gory victories claimed in the Old Testament are exaggerated and that the arrival of the Israelites was more a slow absorption into Canaanite society rather than a bloody replacement of it. However, recent archaeological exploration has uncovered evidence of a large number of destroyed towns and cities, indicating a late Middle Bronze Age time for the Exodus. Such a dating would put the Exodus somewhere in the 100 years between the Hyksos expulsion and the mid-15th century BC. This greatly increases the likelihood that Moses was taken into the Egyptian royal family very soon after the Thebans regained control of the country. We believe it was the training he received in Egypt that gave him the insight and ability to create his own God and establish a new nation in the face of great difficulty. His ruthless methods might have been the only way he could have succeeded. There is much evidence for the strong Egyptian influence on the events of the Exodus, from the design of the Ark of the Covenant to the tablets of hieroglyphics given by Yahweh to Moses, and we think it is entirely logical to assume that the secrets of the Sequenenre resurrection ceremony were taken from Egypt too. Moses clearly treated his people as simple-minded souls, and indeed they must have been very unsophisticated compared to their leader, who was, as we know, skilled in all the secrets of the Egyptians. David and Solomon. The tribes of Israel existed independently for some hundreds of years in a period known as the period of the Judges. These judges were not primarily judicial or magisterial figures, but were localized heroes, or more precisely, saviors. And saviors is in quotes. The generally held idea that the 12 tribes of Israel were all involved in the Exodus is certainly wrong. Only 2 or 3 tribes are now believed to have arrived in this way. At the time of the Judges, the tribes of Simeon and Levi had been virtually wiped out, and the all-important tribe of Judah was only just becoming recognized as being Israelite at all. Slowly, the nomadic Habiru tribesmen became the Hebrew nation of Israelites, and they turned from their wandering ways to become farmers and manufacturers. These elements of the more advanced Canaanite population, which had not been murdered in the invasion, merged with the newcomers and taught them the skills they had developed from thousands of years of agriculture. The oldest book of the Old Testament is the Song of Deborah. This tells us that there was cooperation between some of the tribes when facing a common enemy such as the Philistines. Those tribes that did not provide soldiers for the battle were chided. The role of the judges was different from kingship, in which each judgeship would have very localized power over one or several tribes and provided little political or economic leadership, with allegiance being voluntary. In short, kings were divinely appointed, but judges were not. All judges, however, were not equal. One of the earliest heroes from the time of the initial invasion was the warrior Jerubbaal, who later changed his name to Gideon. His original name was certainly Canaanite, honoring the god Baal, which probably illustrates that at the time Yahweh was not as entrenched as the later authors of the Old Testament would like us to believe. Gideon was offered the kingship of Israel, but declined it, stating that Yahweh was king over them all. Nonetheless, it is clear that he did not. Wow, okay, sorry. Let me start that sentence again. Nonetheless, it is clear that he did hold a special position and has to be viewed as an heir to Moses. Although Gideon refused the kingship, his authority stemmed directly from Moses and certainly surpassed other judges. He founded a religious center at Ophrah, where he made a cult object known as the ephod, which was a type of ark, suggesting that he possessed another god. As a man of influence and power, Gideon kept an extensive harem, possibly including captured Midianite virgins, and reputedly had 70 sons. The principals of these being Abimelech, a name which has suggested to many biblical scholars an increasing royal ideology. It has been taken as evidence that Gideon did accept the kingship, but whether he did or not, his son Abimelech definitely transcended the status of a judge and became king. His temple devoted to Baal Berith has been excavated and found to have been a Migdal, a fortified temple with walls 17 feet thick, and on each side of the doorway, bases for sacred pillars have been found. This was a generation after the death of Moses, and importantly, hundreds of years before Solomon's temple. Yet we have two sacred pillars either side of the doorway in a temple belonging to the first king of the Jews. The instruction on the meanings of the pillars and the ceremony that needed to be associated with them could only have come from Moses via Gideon to Abimelech. It seems to us extremely reasonable to assume that the resurrection ceremony based around the story of Seconenre would have been used by this royal family group, as they could have known of no king-making process other than that which Moses learned in Egypt. The pillars themselves would represent the connection with God and the stability of the new nation. The new state. I said nation and I meant state. I don't know what's wrong with me tonight. Unfortunately for Abimelech, stability was short-lived. His fledgling monarchy crumbled soon after it was established, and he lost his life in a battle with the why did they hyphenate that? Uncooperative people of the city of Thebes. So Thebe, Thebe, and then a Z on the end. So Thebes, I don't know. The period of the judges therefore continued, but the knowledge of the secrets of the royal house and of king-making were kept alive in the line of Gideon's judges. Throughout this period, Jerusalem remained a town that belonged to its ancient founders, the Jebusites. The religious and political center for the Israelites was the city of Shiloh, some 20 miles to the north. Excavations have shown that Shiloh was destroyed in around 1050 BC in the war between the Israelites and the Philistines. This event was witnessed by Samuel, who was an important judge, prophet, priest, and kingmaker. The war between the Israelites and the Philistines is recorded in the biblical story of Samson, who was a Nazarite, a holy man of immense strength. He destroyed 3,000 Philistines by physically pulling down both the left and right hand pillars, which we believe is a metaphor for undermining their national stability. It was Samuel who made the Benjamite Saul king in a private anointing ceremony. No explanation is given in the Bible as to how Samuel knew how to do this, and there is, of course, no description of the ceremony itself. It appears that the relationship between Samuel and Saul was that of the twin powers of priest and king, the two pillars of a successful society uniting to produce stability. This relationship quickly came under stress when Saul made a sacrifice to Gilgal without the benefit of Samuel's ministrations, and when he failed to follow Samuel's instruction to destroy the harem of the defeated Amalekites, Samuel began to regret his choice. A new candidate soon emerged, this time from the major tribe of Judah rather than from the smallest tribe of Benjamin. His name was David, and he came from a small town called Bethlehem. David was, by all accounts, a highly accomplished individual with great skills, first as a courtier, then as a soldier and as a statesman. The well-known story of the slaying of Goliath is generally accepted as true, but it was not David who killed the giant Gittite. That was done by another man from Bethlehem called Elhanan, a son of Jaarigrim. Wow, I don't know. I have no idea how to pronounce that. It's spelled Jaareegr, Jaariorgim. I don't know. The the attributing of the event to David was a later attempt to portray David as a simple shepherd boy unused to war, but the fact was that he was a great soldier and politician throughout his life. Saul saw the threat from David and tried to have him removed, but eventually it was Saul who lost his life and Samuel created his second king. It is not widely appreciated that when David was on the run from Saul, he served in the armies of the Philistines against the Israelites, a strange qualification for the founder of the greatest line in Israel's history. David became king of Israel around 1000 BC, and for the first time truly united the tribes into a single people. There was a striking parallel with the role of the kings of Egypt, in that Israel was also two lands, one north and one northern and one southern, united by one ruler. For the first 7 years, David ruled from Hebron in the southern land of Judah, his most important role was as the king who took Jerusalem, creating a new capital that sat between the two halves of the united kingdom. Here he built himself a palace and moved the tent housing the Ark of the Covenant and the altar to the site of a temple that he proposed to build for Yahweh. David established a well-trained army, largely composed of foreign mercenaries, with which he defeated the Philistines, who still held cities in the region, eventually gaining control of lands from the Euphrates. Wow, okay. I don't know why I didn't. The Euphrates to the Gulf of Aqaba. Peace appeared to be assured to last when David established a peace treaty with Hiram, king of Tyre. But the unruly behavior of David and his family soon brought instability. The events read like something from a Hollywood epic. David fell for Bathsheba and murdered her husband Uriah. David's son, the crown prince Amnon, was killed by his brother Absalom after he had raped his own half-sister Tamar, and Absalom finally tried to take the kingdom from his father by force. After what amounted to civil war, David retained his kingdom, and his son Absalom lost his life hanging from the branches of a tree. All of these distractions prevented David from building the intended temple to house his God, Yahweh. Soon David was on his deathbed, and the heir to the throne, Adoniah, was crowned king. However, before the coronation feast was over, another son by Bathsheba, called Solomon, was anointed king by Zadok with David's assistance. Solomon's ceremony was held to be the true one, and it was not long before the new king did away with his brother and his supporters in case they should ever consider challenging him again. Uh-oh. What's going on here? Am I not? What's going on? Okay. I don't know. Things are acting weird tonight. So I hope this has all been broadcasting. Solomon was set on greatness, and under his rule Israel reached heights never seen before or since. He married the Pharaoh's daughter and was given the strategic city of Gezer on the Egyptian border as a dowry. He created building works across the land, and most importantly of all, he constructed the house of Yahweh, the holy temple for which he is most remembered. As we have already discussed, the temple was a relatively minor undertaking, but nonetheless it was lavishly appointed and centrally located. It stood on a hilltop with its porchway facing east towards the rising sun, and because it was sited more or less on the dividing line of the two lands, one in the north, one in the south, the pillars of that porchway stood to represent the harmony and balance of the United Kingdom. This was a reconstruction of the Egyptian concept of political stability through unity. Boaz, the left-hand pillar, stood to the south, representing the land of Judah and signifying strength. Jacin stood in the north, representing the land of Israel, signifying establishment, and when united by the lintel of Yahweh, the two provided stability. As in ancient Egypt, so long as the two lands were conjoined by the appropriate pillars, political stability would endure. This concept was wholly borrowed from the Egyptians, indicating that the structure of the Israelite monarchy and theology still had not lost its ancient origins. I think we're getting there, yeah. All of this work had to be paid for, and as virtually all of the expertise used was foreign, Hiram, king of Tyre, provided the skilled workforce and most of the raw materials. This was a great expense for the fledgling kingdom, and Solomon started to run out of money, with many cities being sold to pay off the mounting debts. The population had to endure forced labor, with gangs of 10,000 people being sent for monthly spells in the Lebanon to work for Hiram, king of Tyre. The kingdom was split into 12 regions, with each region responsible for providing taxes to the palace for 1 month of each year. Tax levels became increasingly high, and Solomon's subjects began to lose their enthusiasm for their king's desire for grandeur. Despite the way the later authors of the Bible preferred to see it, there is abundant evidence that interest in Yahweh was always pretty thin, and other gods were, for most of the nation's history, held in equal, if not higher, esteem. For many, Yahweh was no more than the Israelite war god, useful in time of battle, but a fairly lowly figure when viewed against the full pantheon of the gods. The names given to notable Israelites down the ages shows a strong respect for Baal, and even the most ardent Yahwist would not pretend that the Jews of this period believed in only one God. So it was with Solomon. Toward the end of his reign, Solomon gave himself over to the sole worship of other gods, which caused dissatisfaction with a number of groups, particularly the priests of the Temple of Jerusalem. It was later rationalized that this wickedness of Solomon's was not punished by Yahweh out of respect for his father David. In short, from the time of Moses right through to Solomon, Yahweh does not seem to have impressed his chosen people very much at all. When Solomon, the king famous for his wisdom, died, the country was not only virtually bankrupt, it was godless. Solomon's son, Rehoboam, was brought up to believe in the power of kingship, and although advised to take a conciliatory line with the aggrieved northerners who did not accept him as king, he continued to demand cooperation. The unity of the two lands quickly fell apart, and the northern kingdom of Israel had no more to do with Judah, which it saw as the source of its problems. Let's sum up what we've learned about the Israelites of this period. The aspirations of the new nation to become a major civilization had been based on a half-structured theology, forced labor, and borrowed money. Like all ill-prepared ventures, it failed, but it left an imprint in the hearts and minds of future generations, who would retrospectively complete that theology and struggle to rebuild the transient glory that had marked out their emergence as a people with a God and a destiny. This was the vision that would never reach its goal, but it would achieve greatness beyond measure. Meanwhile, the secrets of the ceremony of initiation through resurrection and of moral rectitude based on the principles of building a temple were handed down among the royal group. It was no longer an abstract concept taken from the Egyptian story brought to them through Moses. It was real as their temple at Jerusalem that contained the ark and their God. Throughout this stage of our research, we had found no reference at all to the murdered architect of King Solomon's temple. Nonetheless, by now we were beginning to see mounting evidence to support our hypothesis regarding the two pillars and the associated resurrection ceremony of Seqenenre, Tau, who had been taken to Israel by Moses and had become the secret of the royal house of Israel. Our next task was to identify when the name of the central character was changed from Seqenenre Tau to Hiram Abif. In order to understand how these guarded secrets could have survived and eventually come to the surface through the actions of the man we call Jesus the Christ, and how the New Testament could be interpreted in the light of our broader findings, we needed to investigate much more closely the next stage of the history of the Jewish nation. Conclusion for this chapter. The story of the birth of Moses turned out to have been based on a Sumerian legend, and we now felt that it had been adopted as a way of rationalizing how a senior Egyptian general and member of the Egyptian royal family came to be the father of the Jewish nation. We were quite sure that Moses had been privy to these substituted secrets of the Seqenenre Tau, and that he was familiar with the story of the two pillars. He used these secrets to establish a new king-making ritual for his followers. This gave the stateless, cultureless Jews an identity and a secret ritual that was passed on to the line of David. It was Moses who adopted the Kenite turbulent storm god Yahweh, who was identified by the Tau symbol known originally as the Yahweh mark. Once he had made contact with his new god, Moses went back to Egypt, where he was wanted for murder to lead out a group of Habiru. The journey of the Jews into the land of Canaan is depicted in the Bible as one continuous process of slaughter of the indigenous population. Once the religion of Yahweh was established, the people of Yahweh, the Israelites, were led by a series of judges, starting with Joshua, the leader famous for the Battle of Jericho. He was followed by a number of other judges, but both the Bible and archaeological evidence show that the symbol of the two pillars was used by both Abimelech, the son of Gideon, and Samson the Nazarite. We felt that this strongly indicated that the Egyptian secrets of Moses were continuing to be used by the leaders of the Israelites. The prophet Samuel anointed Saul the first king of the Jews, but he was eventually succeeded by David, who was an extremely successful king in around 1000 BC. David united the kingdoms of Judah and Israel with the new capital between the lands at Jerusalem. It was his son Solomon who then built the first temple in Jerusalem, with the two pillars representing the unification of the two kingdoms and forming a gateway that faced eastwards, a pillar in the north representing Judah and a pillar in the south representing Israel. The twin pillars stood in the porchway or entrance to this temple, showing that the Israelite monarchy still had its Egyptian roots and rituals. Solomon died leaving his country virtually bankrupt, but he left the secrets of the ceremony of initiation through living resurrection and of moral rectitude based on the principles of building a temple to be handed down amongst the royal group. We no longer doubted that we had found the secret role model for the building of the Jewish state, but we had found no reference to a murdered builder of Solomon's temple, and we needed to find out how and when Seqenenre became Hiram Abif. And that is the end of the chapter. And that is enough for one night. I know the next chapter is about as long as the one I just read. That would make it a total of 36 pages tonight, and that's too much. I'm not doing it. 32 the other night was a real slog. So, okay, let's go ahead and raid somebody. So I raided Vesper last time. So we've got Hot Dog Raw Dog on. He's playing Sonic and All Stars Racing. Zeus is on. Uh, Enter the Gungeon. Let's see. Yeah, let's go ahead and go. Oh, oh. Nambro's on. We got to go to Nambro. So bear with me for just a few minutes. Give him a couple minutes of your time. Um, say hi if you would, please, and I'll take us on over there. See you in a minute.
Feeling shattered skies, watching teary blue eyes, wonder where I might find some peace.